Isabella Carter had spent 15 years working in the dusty basements of the National Archive, cataloging forgotten pieces of America's past. She thought she had seen everything: Civil War daguerreotypes, Victorian death portraits, even early crime scene photographs that made her stomach turn. But nothing prepared her for what she would discover on that humid Tuesday afternoon in July 2019. The box labeled The Doll's House, 1913, had been sitting in section K47 for over a century, untouched and unremarkable among thousands of similar containers. Isabella pulled it from the shelf with the same mechanical efficiency she'd developed over years of monotonous work. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, she found a series of glass plate negatives and several dozen photographic prints. The images showed what appeared to be an ordinary dollhouse from the Edwardian era, a 3-story Victorian miniature with meticulous detail, complete with tiny furniture, wallpaper, and even miniature oil paintings on the walls. Just another rich family's toy, Isabella muttered to herself, preparing to log the contents and move on to the next box. But something made her pause. Something about the photographs felt wrong. She held one of the prints closer to the desk lamp. The dollhouse was beautiful, certainly, but there was something unsettling about the composition. The camera angles were too deliberate, too carefully framed. And in the parlor room of the miniature house, sitting in a tiny rocking chair, was a doll. A porcelain doll with dark hair, wearing a white dress, its painted eyes staring directly at the camera. Isabella pulled out the next photograph. Same room, same angle, but the doll had moved. It was no longer in the rocking chair, but standing near the miniature fireplace. Her hands began to tremble as she sorted through the remaining images. In each sequential photograph, the doll had shifted position, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. By the final image in the series, the doll stood at the dollhouse's front window, its face pressed against the glass, those painted eyes now seeming to look out at the photographer. At the bottom of the box, Isabella found a handwritten note, the ink faded but still legible. "Stop looking at her, she knows you're watching. C.M. April 1913. Isabella's heart pounded in her chest. After a moment of hesitation, she did what any modern researcher would do. She scanned the images into her computer and began to examine them with digital tools. What she found next would change everything. When she zoomed in on the doll's face in the final photograph, enhancing the image resolution, Isabella's blood ran cold. The doll's eyes weren't just staring at the camera. In the high-resolution scan, she could see that the eyes had pupils, real, human-looking pupils, and in the reflection of those glassy eyes, impossibly small but unmistakably there, was the silhouette of a person standing behind the camera. But here's what made Isabella reach for her phone to call her supervisor. Between frames 7 and 8, in a sequence that should have shown simple stop-motion positioning, there was something else. A blur. A motion blur that suggested the doll hadn't been posed between shots. It had moved on its own while the camera was capturing the image. This wasn't just a century-old dollhouse photograph. This was evidence of something that shouldn't exist. Dr. Caleb Morrison had seen his share of strange artifacts during his 23 years as a professor of American history at Georgetown University. When his former student Isabella Carter called him about the dollhouse photographs, he assumed it was another case of over-eager imagination turning mundane historical objects into mysteries. But the moment Isabella showed him the scanned images on her laptop, his skepticism evaporated. "This can't be right," Caleb whispered, adjusting his glasses as he studied the sequence. The exposure time on glass plate photography from this era was several seconds at minimum. Movement would create a blur like this, yes, but the rest of the image is crystal clear. The doll is the only thing that's blurred. "That's what I thought," Isabella said. "It's like everything else in the frame was perfectly still except for the doll itself." Caleb pulled up the metadata Isabella had compiled. The photographer was listed as CM in the archive records. "Did you find anything else about who that might be?" That's where it gets interesting, Isabella replied, pulling up a separate file on her laptop. I cross-referenced the initials and the date with local records from 1913. I found a Catherine Merrick. She was a professional photographer in Baltimore, which is where these plates were originally archived. She specialized in architectural photography and documented many buildings in the city during that period. What happened to her? She disappeared in May 1913, about a month after these photographs were dated. Her studio was found abandoned, all her equipment still there, but Catherine herself was never seen again. The police at the time ruled it a voluntary disappearance, suggested she might have run away with a lover, but her family insisted something terrible had happened. Caleb leaned back in his chair, the academic in him warring with the evidence before his eyes. We need to authenticate these images, make sure they haven't been tampered with or manipulated. Over the next 3 weeks, Caleb assembled a team. He brought in Anthony Chen, a forensic photograph analyst who had worked on authenticating historical images for the Library of Congress. He contacted Logan Pierce, a materials scientist specializing in dating photographic materials. And he reached out to Dr. Aidan Walsh, a psychologist who studied optical illusions and perceptual phenomena. The team met in Caleb's office on a sweltering August morning. Anthony had finished his preliminary analysis of the glass plates themselves, which Isabella had carefully transported from the archive under controlled conditions. These are genuine, Anthony announced, spreading his report across the conference table. The glass plates are period-appropriate, showing the correct aging patterns and chemical composition for silver gelatin emulsions from the 1910s. The emulsion hasn't been tampered with. No signs of double exposure, no scratching or painting on the plates, no evidence of early photographic manipulation techniques. Whatever we're seeing in these images was captured by the camera at the time the photographs were taken. Logan nodded in agreement. I've analyzed the deterioration patterns in the gelatin, the oxidation of the glass, even the paper used for the prints found in the box. Everything dates to 1913, plus or minus 2 years. These aren't modern forgeries or recreations. Aidan, however, looked troubled. I've been studying the sequential nature of these images, and I have to tell you, this doesn't match any known pattern of stop-motion photography from the era. The positions of the doll change in ways that would require extremely sophisticated understanding of movement and animation, techniques that weren't developed until decades later. But more than that, the motion blur in frame 8 suggests the doll moved during the exposure itself. If someone was manually posing the doll between shots, there would be no blur. The blur only makes sense if the doll moved on its own while the shutter was open. That's impossible, Caleb said, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it? Isabella interjected. She had been quiet until now, but there was an intensity in her eyes that made everyone turn to look at her. I've been doing more research on Catherine Merrick. I found her personal diary in a separate archive at the Maryland Historical Society, and what she wrote in the weeks before she disappeared. Isabella paused, pulling out a folder of photocopied pages. Listen to this. April 3rd, 1913. The commission from Mrs. Hartford seemed simple enough. Document her daughter's dollhouse for insurance purposes. But there is something deeply wrong with that toy. The doll inside, the one Mrs. Hartford calls Lily, seems to watch me as I work. I know this sounds absurd, but I swear its position changes between setups, even when no one has touched it. The room fell silent. Isabella continued reading. April 10th, 1913. I returned today to complete the photographs. Mrs. Hartford's daughter, Evelyn, age 7, refuses to play with the dollhouse anymore. She says Lily whispers to her at night. Mrs. Hartford laughed it off as a child's imagination, but I noticed she wouldn't go near the dollhouse herself. When I was alone with it in the parlor preparing my camera, I heard something, a soft sound, like breathing, coming from inside the miniature rooms. I must be working too hard. I need rest. April 15th, 1913. I've developed the plates. God help me, I've developed the plates, and what I've seen in them cannot be explained. In the final photograph, the doll is at the window, and I swear I can see something in its eyes. Not a reflection of me, but something else. Something that was watching from inside the doll. I will not return to the Hartford house. Mrs. Hartford sent a messenger today demanding the photographs. I told him they were damaged in development. I cannot let these images leave my studio. I cannot let anyone else see what I've seen. April 28, 1913. It's here. Somehow, it's here. I don't know how, but the doll is in my studio. I sealed these photographs in a box, marked them, and hid them. If someone finds this diary and finds the box, I beg you, destroy the photographs. Destroy them and burn the doll. Do not let it. Isabella looked up. That's where the diary ends. The final entry is unfinished. Catherine disappeared 3 days later. Caleb felt a chill run down his spine despite the summer heat. Did you find any record of what happened to the Hartford family? To the dollhouse itself? That's the thing, Isabella said. The Hartford house burned down in June 1913. The fire started in the parlor, the same room where the dollhouse had been kept. Mrs. Hartford and her daughter survived, but they both died in an asylum within 2 years. The official cause was listed as shared psychotic disorder. They both insisted something had escaped from the dollhouse during the fire and that it was hunting them. Anthony cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. I'm a scientist. I deal in evidence and facts, but I have to admit, I've never seen anything like this. The technical aspects of these photographs are impossible to explain using conventional means. So, what do we do? Logan asked. Do we publish our findings? Do we go public with this? Caleb stood and walked to the window, looking out at the campus below. Students walked between classes, living their normal lives, completely unaware that in this small office, 4 people were grappling with evidence that challenged everything they understood about reality. We need to find the doll, Caleb said finally. If the Hartford house burned in 1913, but the family survived initially, there might be estate records, auction records, something that tells us what happened to the contents of that house. You want to find a potentially cursed doll from 1913? Aidan asked incredulously. A doll that may have driven its owner's family insane. I want answers, Caleb replied. And right now, that doll is the only thing that can provide them. What Caleb didn't tell his team was that he had been having dreams since Isabella first showed him the photographs. Dreams where he stood in a Victorian parlor watching a dollhouse with growing dread. In these dreams, he could hear someone crying inside the miniature rooms, a sound that was both impossibly small and deafeningly loud. And always, always at the edge of his vision, he could see the doll moving, turning its head to look at him with those glassy, knowing eyes. He told himself it was just stress, just his imagination working overtime. But deep down, he knew better. Whatever had been captured in those 1913 photographs, whatever Catherine Merrick had encountered in the Hartford parlor, it was still out there. And now, by examining these images, by bringing them into the light after a century of darkness, they had gotten its attention. The investigation had only just begun, but Caleb already suspected how it would end, the same way it had ended for Catherine Merrick, the same way it had ended for the Hartford family. Some mysteries, he realized with growing dread, were meant to stay buried. Some boxes were meant to remain unopened. Some photographs were meant to fade into obscurity, their secrets dying with the emulsion on forgotten glass plates. But it was too late for such wisdom now. They had looked into the doll's eyes, and the doll had looked back. Grayson Ellis had spent 40 years as a private investigator specializing in estate liquidations and historical property research. When Dr. Morrison hired him to trace the Hartford family's possessions after the 1913 fire, Grayson thought it would be a straightforward paper chase, the kind of thing he could wrap up in a week or two. 3 months later, sitting in a coffee shop across from Caleb, Grayson pushed a thick folder across the table with hands that trembled slightly. "I've worked a lot of strange cases," Grayson began, his voice raspy from too many years and too many cigarettes. "But this one, Doc, this one goes places I didn't expect." "What did you find?" Caleb asked, though part of him wanted to stand up and walk away to leave the folder unopened to let this entire investigation die right here. After the fire, Victoria Hartford, the mother, and her daughter Evelyn were institutionalized at the Shepherd Pratt Hospital. The records indicate they were both suffering from what doctors at the time called hysterical delusions. But here's what caught my attention. The intake notes describe both of them as having identical nightmares, identical fears, and identical descriptions of what they claimed was haunting them. "The doll," Caleb said. "A porcelain doll named Lily, yes, but it gets stranger. The hospital records indicate that 17 other patients at Shepherd Pratt between 1913 and 1915 reported seeing the same doll. 17 people who had never met the Hartfords, who had no connection to that family, all described the same dark-haired porcelain doll appearing in their rooms at night, watching them from corners, whispering things they couldn't quite make out." Caleb felt his mouth go dry. "That's impossible." "Is it?" Grayson pulled out a series of photocopied medical records. "Look at this. Patient admitted September 1913, 3 months after the Hartford fire. Reports nightly visitations from a doll-like figure, insists it speaks to her in a child's voice, telling her secrets about the dead. Patient admitted November 1913. Extreme paranoia, claims a Victorian doll sits at the end of his bed each night, watching him with eyes that follow movement. December 1913, January 1914, March 1914. All of them, Doc, all of them saw the same thing." "What happened to these patients?" Grayson's expression darkened. 12 of them died under mysterious circumstances. Sudden heart failure, unexplained seizures, one apparently stopped breathing for no medical reason. The others, he paused, the others all disappeared from the hospital, just vanished from locked rooms with no explanation. Caleb's mind raced. The estate records. What happened to the Hartford family's belongings after the fire? "That's where things get really interesting," Grayson said, pulling out another set of documents. Most of the contents were destroyed in the fire, but there was an auction of the surviving items in August 1913. I tracked down the auction house records. The dollhouse, or what remained of it, was not listed in the auction inventory. But there was a notation in the ledger, a handwritten note from the auction master. "Doll removed from premises by E.H., no sale." E.H. Evelyn Hartford? That's what I thought initially, but Evelyn was institutionalized by that point. She couldn't have removed anything. So I dug deeper. Turns out there was an E.H. who worked for the auction house, Edward Hughes. I found his descendant, his great-granddaughter, living in Baltimore, and she had a story to tell. Grayson pulled out a handwritten letter, freshly written. "This is from Sarah Hughes. Edward kept a journal, which has been passed down through the family. In it, he wrote about the Hartford estate sale. Would you like me to read what he said?" Caleb nodded, unable to speak. "August 7th, 1913, Grayson read. Today I made a decision that may cost me my position, but I cannot in good conscience sell what I found in the Hartford property ruins. While cataloging items for auction, I discovered a doll, intact, miraculously undamaged by the fire that consumed the house around it. The doll sat in what remained of a dollhouse, surrounded by ashes and debris, yet without a single mark upon its porcelain face. When I picked it up to add to the inventory, I felt such a wave of cold dread that I nearly dropped it. The doll's eyes seemed to follow me. I know how absurd this sounds. I am a rational man, a man of business. But I swear on my life that doll was aware. It was watching me. It knew me. I took it from the auction house that night. I couldn't bear the thought of selling it to some unsuspecting family, of inflicting whatever curse it carries upon another household. I will dispose of it myself, Somewhere it can never harm anyone again." "Where did he take it?" Caleb demanded. "That's the thing," Grayson said grimly. "He never wrote about that. His journal entries become increasingly erratic after that date. References to nightmares, to seeing things in his peripheral vision, to hearing a child's voice in his house when he was alone. The final entry is from September 15th, 1913. "It won't let me destroy it. Every time I try, to burn it, to break it, to bury it, I find myself unable to complete the act. It's in my house now. It moves through the rooms at night. My wife has left me, says I've gone mad. Perhaps I have. But the doll is real. The doll is here, and I think it wants something from me." What happened to Edward Hughes? He died October 3rd, 1913. Heart attack, according to the death certificate. He was 42 years old, previously healthy. When his body was found, his face was frozen in an expression of such terror that the undertaker noted it in his records, said it was the worst he'd ever seen. Edward's mouth was open as if he'd been screaming, and his eyes were fixed on something in the corner of the room, though there was nothing there when they found him. Caleb felt the walls of the coffee shop closing in around him. The doll. What happened to the doll after Edward died? Grayson met his eyes. According to Edward's estate records, all of his possessions were donated to various charities and churches. But there's no specific mention of a doll in the inventory. Sarah Hughes, his great-granddaughter, says there's a family legend that Edward had hidden something in his house before he died, something that was never found. When his widow sold the property in 1920, the new owners reported strange occurrences: footsteps in empty rooms, a child's laughter, objects moving on their own. The house changed hands 17 times over the next 60 years. Every family reported similar phenomena. It was finally demolished in 1982. "So, the trail ends there," Caleb said, feeling an odd mixture of relief and disappointment. "Not quite," Grayson said quietly. "Before the house was demolished, there was one final owner, a woman named Margaret Price. She lived there for 6 months in 1981 before she had a complete psychological breakdown and was hospitalized. I managed to track her down. She's in a nursing home now, 89 years old, and she agreed to talk to us." "Us?" "I told her about our investigation, about the photographs, about the Hartford family, about Edward Hughes, and she said she's been waiting for someone to ask her about the doll for 40 years. 2 days later, Caleb, Isabella, and Grayson sat in the sun-filled common room of the Meadowbrook nursing home, across from a frail woman with sharp, intelligent eyes that belied her age. Margaret Price looked at each of them in turn, then spoke in a voice that was surprisingly strong. "You want to know about Lily." "You know the doll's name?" Isabella asked, startled. "She told me herself," Margaret replied. "The night I found her." For the next hour, Margaret told them her story. How she discovered a hidden compartment in the basement of Edward Hughes' old house, beneath the floorboards, in what had once been a coal cellar. Inside that compartment, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow preserved it perfectly through 70 years, was the doll. "She was beautiful," Margaret whispered, staring into a distance only she could see. Dark hair, perfect porcelain skin, wearing a white dress with lace trim. I thought she was valuable, an antique worth money. I brought her upstairs, cleaned her off, put her on the mantel in my living room. That night, I woke up to find her sitting on my bed, facing me. I told myself I must have been sleepwalking, that I'd moved her in my sleep. But I knew better. I knew because her eyes were different. They were no longer painted porcelain. They were real, human eyes, dark and knowing, set in that porcelain face. "What happened then?" Caleb asked softly. "She spoke to me, not with a voice I could hear, but with words that appeared in my mind. She told me her name was Lily, and that she had been waiting for someone to find her. She told me she was lonely, that she'd been trapped for so long, that she just wanted someone to play with her. And for a moment, God help me, for a moment, I felt sorry for her. Can you imagine? Feeling sorry for a thing that wasn't even alive? Margaret's hands shook as she continued. Over the next weeks, she told me more. She showed me things. Visions of the past, of the families she had known. I saw Catherine Merrick, the photographer, in her studio trying to seal the doll away. I saw Evelyn Hartford, the little girl who had first owned her, crying in her bed as Lily whispered secrets in the dark. I saw Edward Hughes, trying desperately to destroy her, to end whatever curse she carried. And I saw what happened to all of them. "What is she?" Isabella asked. "What is Lily?" I don't know if she was ever human, or if she's something else that learned to imitate humanity. But she's been around for a very long time, longer than 1913, longer than any of the records we've found. She told me she's had many names, many forms. The doll is just her current vessel. She needs people to see her, to acknowledge her existence. When someone looks at her, really looks at her, tries to understand her, she forms a connection. And once that connection is made, she won't let go. "How did you survive?" Caleb asked. "Everyone else who encountered her either died or went mad." Margaret smiled sadly. "I didn't survive. Not really. Look at where I am. Look at what I became. After 6 months with that doll, I had to be institutionalized. It took years of therapy before I could function again. Even now, 40 years later, I still see her sometimes. In reflections, in photographs, standing at the edge of my vision. The connection she made with me never truly ended." "Where is the doll now?" Grayson asked. "That's why I agreed to see you," Margaret said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Because after I was taken away to the hospital, the house was sold, and, in the confusion, the doll disappeared again. I've spent decades trying to find her, trying to warn people, but no one would listen. Everyone thought I was just a crazy old woman. But you've seen the photographs. You know she's real. You can help me find her before she destroys another life." She pulled an envelope from her pocket with trembling hands. "I've kept records over the years, reports of similar phenomena, stories that match Lily's pattern. The last confirmed sighting was 3 months ago, in Virginia. A collector purchased an antique doll at an estate sale. Dark hair, porcelain face, white dress. Within weeks, he started reporting the same things I experienced. Last month, he drove his car into a river. The police ruled it a suicide, but they never found the doll in his apartment." Margaret handed the envelope to Caleb. "She's still out there, still moving from person to person, from family to family, leaving destruction in her wake. And now that you've looked into this, now that you've studied those photographs and tried to understand her—" She paused, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and fear. "She knows about you. All of you. You've drawn her attention." That night, back in his hotel room, Caleb couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the photographs, about Catherine Merrick's diary, about the 17 patients at Shepherd Pratt who had all seen the same impossible thing. He thought about Edward Hughes dying in terror, about the Hartford family's tragic end, about Margaret Price's decades of torment. And he thought about his dreams, the dreams that had been growing more vivid since he'd first examined the glass plates. The Victorian parlor, the crying from inside the miniature rooms, the doll turning to look at him. In his dreams, the doll had begun to speak. She called him by name. She told him she was coming. At 3:47 a.m., Caleb's phone rang. It was Isabella, her voice shaking. "I know it's late, but I had to call. I'm at my apartment, and I think you need to come over." "What's wrong?" "Just come, please." 20 minutes later, Caleb stood in Isabella's living room, staring at her laptop. On the screen was a photograph she had taken that evening. A selfie. Just a casual picture she'd snapped before going to bed. But there, in the reflection of a mirror behind her, clear as day despite the low resolution, was something that shouldn't be there. A dark-haired porcelain doll in a white dress, standing in the doorway of Isabella's bedroom, staring directly at the camera. "I didn't see it when I took the picture," Isabella whispered. "It wasn't there. I would have noticed. But when I looked at the photo just now—" She broke off, unable to continue. Caleb felt his blood turn to ice. He pulled out his own phone, opened his photo gallery, and began scrolling through recent pictures. There, in a photo from the coffee shop where they'd met with Grayson. In the background, barely visible, a familiar figure. And there again, in a picture he'd taken on campus last week, before he'd even met with Margaret Price. Always in the background, always watching. "She's been following us," Caleb said, "for weeks, maybe longer, since we first opened that box." "What do we do?" Isabella asked. Before Caleb could answer, both of their phones buzzed simultaneously with a text message from Grayson. "Emergency! Come to my office, now." They arrived to find Grayson's office in disarray. Papers scattered across the floor, file cabinets open, and Grayson himself sitting at his desk, his face ashen. On the desk in front of him sat a small cardboard box. "It was on my doorstep when I got home an hour ago," Grayson said without preamble. "No return address, no postmark, just this box with my name on it." "What's inside?" Isabella asked, though part of her already knew. Grayson reached out with shaking hands and opened the box. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that was yellowed with age, was a porcelain doll. Dark hair, white dress, eyes that seemed to follow their every movement. "She's come home," whispered a voice that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. A child's voice, sweet and terrible. The three of them stood frozen, staring at the impossible thing before them. Lily, the doll that had haunted Catherine Merrick in 1913, that had driven the Hartford family to madness, that had killed Edward Hughes and tormented Margaret Price, sat before them as pristine and perfect as the day she was first crafted, however many years ago that might have been. And as they watched, unable to move or speak or breathe, the doll's mouth slowly curved into a smile. Outside, in the streets of Washington, D.C., people went about their lives, unaware that in a cluttered investigator's office, three people had just come face to face with something that defied all rational explanation. Something that had waited patiently through decades of darkness and obscurity, biding its time, collecting souls like a child collects toys. Lily had returned, and this time, she had no intention of being forgotten again. In the days that followed, Dr. Caleb Morrison, Isabella Carter, and Grayson Ellis each tried to distance themselves from the doll, from the investigation, from each other. But distance, they would learn, meant nothing to something like Lily. She had marked them the moment they'd looked at those 1913 photographs. She had claimed them as surely as she'd claimed all the others who had tried to understand her mystery. The box sat unopened in a secure storage facility, under lock and key, surrounded by protective measures that seemed laughable given what they now knew. But still, they tried to contain her, to stop her influence from spreading. It didn't work, because the truth, as Margaret Price had tried to warn them, was simple and terrible. Once Lily had your attention, once you truly looked at her and tried to understand what she was, she never let go. The photographs from 1913, labeled "The Doll's House," remained in the National Archive. Sometimes late-night security guards reported seeing the images change when they weren't looking directly at them, the doll moving to different positions, new reflections appearing in her glassy eyes, and always, that painted smile that seemed to grow wider in the darkness. But these were just stories, of course. Urban legends told by tired workers on the night shift, seeking to add excitement to their mundane jobs. Just stories. Unless you've looked at the photographs yourself. Unless you've seen what Isabella and Caleb and Grayson saw. Unless you've drawn Lily's attention. Then the stories become something else entirely. Then they become a warning that comes too late. Some archives are meant to remain closed. Some photographs are meant to fade into obscurity. Some mysteries are meant to stay buried. But it's too late for such wisdom now. If you've read this far, if you followed this investigation to its conclusion, if you've wondered about the doll and where she might be now, look behind you. Look at your reflection. Look at that photograph on your phone that you don't remember taking. She's waiting. She's always waiting. And now that you know her story, now that you've thought about her, imagined her, tried to understand her, you're one of hers too.